This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
A music video on the Atari 800. So it was video and art being displayed on the Atari 800 that was in sync with music that was playing off of a CD. Because you're targeting the Xylons, you're putting them in your crosshairs, you're actually their AI. All they had to do was this very simple AI to move around, and because you're tracking them, the closer you track them, the more accurate they become. You let the player fight themselves.
I'm Kevin Savitz, and this is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. Here's how Aric Wilmunder introduced himself to me in email. Quote, "When the Last Starfighter didn't do well in the theaters and marketing rebranded the Atari 800 Last Starfighter game as Star Raiders 2, they didn't take into account that there was already an actual sequel to Star Raiders that was just a few months away from completion. I was the designer and solo engineer who worked for about a year on the project as a member of an R&D team inside Atari Coin-Op. A friend helped me copy the disk image a few years back, and when I saw Steve Hales post your tweet about the source code for Star Raiders, I thought there might be some interest. The game was close to being finished, but there were still parts that needed polishing, like the enemy AI, so I've been hesitant to release it since it might be judged as a finished work. I'd hate to wait 30 years to release the game just to get a bad review." Unquote. Aric Wilmunder started writing programs on the Exidy Sorcerer computer, then worked at Automated Simulations, writing the Atari 8-bit conversions of Star Warrior, Crush, Crumble, and Chomp, and Temple of Apshai. Next, he worked at Atari's corporate research department, where he worked on Chris Crawford's Gossip game. Then, in the R&D department at Atari Coin-Op, he created Star Raiders 2 for the Atari 8-bit computers, a game that was never finished nor released until today. Later, he worked at Lucasfilm Games, where his work included the XEGS version of Ballblazer. This interview took place December 5th, 2015. Check the show notes at AtariPodcast.com to download the unfinished, unreleased Star Raiders 2. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me how you got hired by Atari.
Got hired by Atari in '83. It was an internship position in Atari Corporate Research, which was a group that was led by Dr. Alan Kay, who's probably best known for his work on the Dynabook. He and a group of MIT researchers started up the corporate research group at Atari, and then under Dr. Alan Kay, I was working for Chris Crawford. But before Atari, I'd been, I'd started writing computer games when I was in junior high school and college. I was putting myself through college writing games, not initially for the Atari 800, but for another machine, the Exidy Sorcerer, which was a Z80-based machine. Mm-hmm. And I came home after my freshman year, and I think I hung around the house a little too long. My mom told me to go out and get a job. So I looked up a couple of game companies, and one let me know, told me to call them back in a week, and the other one said, sure, stop by this afternoon. So I started working for a little company in Mountain View called Automated Simulations.
Which would become Epics?
Became Epics, and Automated... while I was there, I was working for John Freeman and Jim Connolly and Ann Westfall. Mm-hmm. John and Ann went on to become two of the first developers for Electronic Arts. And then later, Paul Ritchie became my first artist. He's now the founder of Toys for Bob that developed the Skylander toys that are out there today. So I'd been doing games for, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years, a couple years professionally while I was still in college. And I wrote a letter to Atari trying to get a job there, and it got dropped in the circular bin. And so then I went through some contacts and got a resume into corporate research. And they brought me in initially as an intern and then asked me if I'd stay and finish the project there.
Nice. All right. So before we get to Atari, I don't want to gloss over what you did at Automated Simulations. What did you do there, and how long were you there?
I worked there probably a year and a half. As I mentioned, I was a college student, and I showed up. I had no living expenses, and but I'd had some experience on the Atari 800. I'd worked for a little company called Compumax in downtown Palo Alto, and I was doing home products. So I had developed the Atari version of a product called Micro Home, which was, I think it was 10 different home utility packages. So inside it, it had a checkbook balancing program. You could save your recipes. You could figure out your gas mileage. And these weren't terribly exciting, but what I would do is I would add graphic introductions to them. So when you were going into the program to do your gas mileage, you would put a dashboard on the display, and you'd watch the speedometer go up and the engine rev, and then you'd watch your gas gauge as it slowly sank. And so I sort of wrote these cute introductions, and so I used this as my foot in the door to get into Automated to do games along with the experience that I had developing. I did a version of Space Invaders for the Exidy Sorcerer, so I had a variety of experiences there. So they didn't have an Atari 800 coder at the time, but they had a number of games that had been developed for the Radio Shack TRS-80. And so what they did was they just placed a small bet on this college student who came in the door and said, well, hey, can you get these running on the Atari 800? And so I think by the end of the summer, I'd finished the first project there, which was, this will be 1981. So that was a game called Star Warriors, and sort of a version of Starship Troopers, but done as an Atari 800 game. Mm-hmm. And then before I left to go back to college, they teamed me up with Paul Ritchie, and I'd already started to work on Crush, Crumble, and Chomp, where a game which was very much like a computer version of The Creature That Ate Sheboygan. You get to be the monster, and then you get to go in and destroy the city. So you get to decide if you're the giant Godzilla-type creature, or the giant ape, or the giant kraken, and you can pull down all the bridges. And then meanwhile, you will always lose because those darn humans will get to you. But sort of the game is how long can you live through that. And then again, while I was in college, I did Temple of Apshai, a couple of expansion packs, Hellfire Warrior, and I'm credited with doing Datestones of Rin, though I have no specific recollection of having done that game as well. But there were a lot of products that I worked on at the time.
Well, I spent a lot of time playing Temple of Apshai, and thank you for that.
Well, my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Sort of sorry I didn't actually pay for it, but
it's being in the software industry. You sort of get used to that. When I was at Lucasfilm, we used the slogan "often duplicated, rarely imitated."
Nice. So can you tell me any stories or anything about working on those games? It sounds like they were already TRS-80 things, so you just were converting them to the Atari. How much leeway did you have in making them awesome for the Atari?
The key thing there was they had, as you pointed out, they had been designed. The TRS-80, these were games that were originally developed from a group that was very familiar with pen and paper games and such. And so John Freeman was the lead designer. I think Jim Connolly had done a lot of the initial coding, and they used the tools that were available to them. And on the TRS-80, there was a version of BASIC, and unfortunately, it was different than the version of BASIC that ran on the Atari 800. So it wasn't just a case of typing it in. It was a case of okay, what do you do when you don't have these particular commands in the language? Their system also had very rudimentary graphics, so they could do basically they could put big bricks down for walls, and your main character would look like 6 bricks that looked like an arrow that would just change directions. And so with the Atari 800, once I had the code running and running under the Atari 800 BASIC, then I could go in and start playing around with the graphics and the sounds and the other capabilities that the 800 had. So instead of using just the bricks, I could actually, I worked with the artists and they designed fonts that had walls that looked more stone-like. And instead of just this arrow, they developed a main character. And this is a case where I was very fortunate. As I mentioned, the first product I worked with was Star Warrior, and I didn't have an artist. So if you look at the art there, the main character kind of looks like a dead cactus, except when he uses the rocket pack, and then he looks like a live cactus. And then by the time I was working on Crush, Crumble, and Chomp with Paul Ritchie as the artist, then the bridges looked like bridges, and the monsters, had animation, and the police cars had sirens on the tops, and the police soldiers, their feet would go through an animation cycle. So the goal wasn't just to port the game, and I've always thought that the word port was a 4-letter word, and you should try to avoid it. The real goal was to take the spirit of the game, the design that the original developers wanted, and then build a version of the game that took as much advantage as possible of the capabilities of the machine that you were targeting. And so at the time, the Atari 800 with sound and graphics and player missiles and sprites, it was certainly an opportunity to take advantage of that, but still keep the spirit of a dungeon crawl where you're going in and exploring.
Okay, great. Port is a 4-letter word. I like that.
Well, I've always, I try to use the term cross-platform development. It's not quite as a sexy term, but I use that approach as well when I was at LucasArts. So I was at the time managing games on PCs and Macs and even Atari STs and Amigas and the Fujitsu Towns and the Fujitsu Marty and the Sega CD. And so the idea there was you built a really great product, and then when you moved it from one platform to another, you really wanted to leverage as much as you could, and at the same time take advantage of the capabilities of the target platform.
Okay. So what caused you to leave automated simulations and look for work at Atari Corporate Research?
Part of it was the next summer was coming along, and so I'd worked in the side doing the work for Automated. I think at that time, Automated was also doing that transition to Epic. So I think new management had come in. Mm-hmm. I think John and Ann and many of the others that I'd worked closely with were moving on in the organization. The new owners did the brand switch over to Epix, which was kind of funny because my mother owned the brand name Epix for it was engineering products, I think, for import and export. So she ran a business called Epix that did business here. And actually, when Epix Automated wanted to change their name to Epix, they had to contact my mom to get approval to be able to use the Epix name because there was fear of confusion. But they also became
funny. I don't mean to interrupt. John told me that same story, but I didn't know that was you he was talking about, or your mom.
Oh, my mom kind of came to me one day. It's like, I got this letter. I thought you worked with these guys. And it's like, oh, yeah, I hadn't seen it. But I didn't see any reason where, since my mom mainly did import and export of machinery goods into Latin America, where computer games were going to be a big conflict. There was also a switch that was going from, that was moving towards Commodore 64. And there was a little bit of a rivalry there. I was always very proud of the Atari 800 hardware, really liked working on that machine. They were also doing moves towards their, I forget what they were called at the time. They did a number of actually very good sporting games that I think probably destroyed more Atari and Commodore 64 joysticks than anything else, because you really beat the joysticks up at the time. And so that door was sort of, it was great. And I have to say that because I was a college student and had no expenses, I just went in there and said, sure, I'll do the game for $100, and I forget what I asked for, like 10% or something. Actually, I said I would do it for free, just give me 10% royalties. And they thought that paying me nothing was a little strange, so they insisted that they at least pay me $100 a game. But then by the time I was done doing this, I had more money in the bank from royalties. I took my girlfriend, when she got her undergraduate degree, to Europe for 6 weeks and came back, and I had more money in the bank. By the time I got back, I should have just gone back for another 6 weeks. So, had done those games, and then, like I said, went back to college and had been developing those games while I was a college student. And I was at USC, which was great because I love cinema, and so I would. I wasn't a cinema major, but I'd go sign up for as many of those classes as I could and just drop in on all the other classes at the same time. And but when the opportunity, to me, Atari was this amazing place. I was expecting scientists in white lab coats studying, game players from behind one-way mirrors. I was expecting it to be, it was, to me, Atari was the pinnacle of game development. I'd followed their products, I'd played their products, I liked their hardware, and so the opportunity to go work for them was just something that there was no way that I could turn down. And unfortunately, it went from my dream job to a little bit of a nightmare just in a matter of weeks.
How come?
I was hired, as I mentioned, I was hired into Atari Corporate Research, and the product that I was given was very different than anything I'd worked on before. It was a social game, and it was very mathematical, which is fine. I have no issues with math, but I'll come back to that later. And the model for it was essentially the human player and then as many as 7 computer-controlled players. And the physical model is you create this 3-dimensional model in space, and you put springs in between each of the points in space. And during the gameplay, you're sort of adjusting the tension on each of these springs individually, and then you throw the model up in the air, and then it finds a new equilibrium, and that's the turn. And but the goal of the game was to become the most popular person amongst those 8.
So we're talking about Chris Crawford's Gossip game.
I didn't like to say names, but yes, we are.
Okay.
And Chris had written this as an Atari 800 basic game that took almost a day, I think, or certainly hours to do the calculations between moves. And so the process of playing a single game would take you a week or more to be able to see what the outcomes were. Wow. And so what I was tasked with was to take this game that took hours and hours per move and basically make each of these moves occur in a matter of seconds. But I think there was it's tough. And it was a great opportunity. We didn't see eye to eye in more than one meeting. Even with other people on the team, there would be disagreements, and the way it was presented to us was, if you understood the issue, you'd agree with me. And from that point, how do you go from there? Because what you've just been told is you're wrong. If you understood, then you change your opinion. And that just wasn't the case. And I came from an environment where game development was sunshine and happiness, and you're going to get to do something great, and it's fun, and you love what you do. And I walked into an environment where game design was tough decisions and rainy walks at night in thunderstorms, where everything you do is a compromise because it's, you've got this grandiose vision of what you want to do, but every step you take is taking that vision and cutting it down to something that has to fit on a floppy disk. And so we just came from philosophically very different ends of the spectrum.
So a few weeks there, you were working on this game, and it went from potentially fun to just a task that you weren't enjoying, it sounds like.
It really wasn't. It was interesting because at the same time, there's another team that was working there and working on Excalibur. And very much like the regular, the Sim games that had been developed, this one, though, felt like, you were sort of going out and beating the tar out of other people. And instead, the arthurial myths were uplifting, and and they make movies about what a wonderful times it was, and musicals about it, and yet here you are going out and pounding on people. And I remember sitting in the office with one of the developers, and he said, "This doesn't feel like King Arthur. This feels like gangsters." And I thought about that night, and I came in the next evening on my own time, and I wrote. I just did the intro screen for this game I called Chicago Kingpin, where it just showed a brick wall, and then you heard machine guns going rat-a-tat-tat-tat, and it just spelled out. So I had done a drawing mechanism that could draw in machine gun bullets Chicago Kingpin against this brick wall. So it was sort of like the intro was Welcome to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And I actually, on my own time, did a bunch of research into how the mobs actually ran, and how much money they made off of alcohol for prohibition, and how much they made off of various areas. And I was looking at, could you design a game around being a gangster, and you've got the Public Enemy number. And so I was always playing around with game ideas and having fun with that. And that's actually what ended up sort of segueing into Star Raiders. And so during the day, I was working on Gossip, and then at night, I was always very fond of Star Raiders, the game. To me, this was an incredible pinnacle of software achievement, and the fact that it was done by one person who was supposed to have been writing something else. And yet he went off, and his manager let him go off and write this game, which probably sold more Atari 800s than anything that, any other single activity that Atari did was this little skunkwork project. Because you'd go into a computer shop, and we'd never seen a first-person game. We'd never seen a real universe where I could go from the front view to the long-range scan to the galactic chart, and everything is running in real time. I had done, in junior high, I had rewritten a version of the typical Star Trek game. And it was always, it was turn-based. You'd fire your photon torpedoes, or you jump from one quadrant to the other. And one of the things that I was always trying to do is finding ways that the game could stay live and keep moving constantly while you were having to make decisions. Because otherwise, with the turn-based games, you could go away for lunch, and those Klingons that were firing photons at you that photon torpedo stopped as soon as it waited for your turn. And that was just a very different type of gameplay where, the arcade games, the real-time games, to me were very fascinating. So what I would do is I would work at Gossip during the daytime, and then at night I would start working on code to do, how do you do a star field? How do you rotate a planet? How do you draw a spaceship? So I began writing all these bits and pieces of code, and eventually I met up with one engineer, and he said, "Oh, well, you know how to do the star field," and he gave me this this article out of a magazine about how to do rotation in space, just only using addition and subtraction. And I didn't know if that was the same algorithm that had been used, but I began experimenting with this because the processors at the time didn't have multiplies. They didn't have divides. The only thing you could do is add and subtract two numbers from each other. So I began developing the ability to rotate points around in space, and then figuring out how to get those points to go into a first-person view, and using the same, how do you do a line draw? How do you do a vector draw for a spaceship? So I began experimenting with those at night. And when Gossip was finished, or at least my part of it was finished, I pretty much was ready to just walk away. And actually, I'd walked away from my dream job. I announced that that I was going to leave. And Chris was pretty upset. I know he brought in the wife of a person that I'd worked with who was an optics major. Chris was convinced that my mathematics was flawed in the implementation of his game, and that if I'd gotten the math right, the game would be fun. And I just didn't think the game was much fun. So he brought in a woman who's had, I think, a master's degree in optics. And if you look at optics, it is nothing but math. It is light beams and vectors. And she went through, she redid it, and guess what? It still was, from my conversations with her, she went through my code. She didn't find any flaws. The game, tragically, was just flawed from the concept. And every once in a while, you just have to look at something and learn from it and move on. Well, so I had announced that I was going to depart, and
so were you basically leaving because you didn't want to continue working with Chris? I mean, I'm just going to go and say it that.
I wouldn't have quite put it so bluntly, but and there are lots of wonderful things. I have a lot of respect for Chris for his creation of the computer game development conference and things like that. But I was a team player. Chris is a bit of a lone wolf. Our styles were just very different, and he's done some pretty remarkable products at the time. I probably wouldn't have developed a game where you get to play Nazi Germany in World War II. That's just my philosophy. I'd rather be trying to defeat the Nazis. I did a presentation at Macworld, and Chris was presenting, I think he called it Balance of the Planet, and at the same time, I think the team was showing Sim Earth. And it was interesting because the philosophies were just so different even between those games, where Sim Earth was, this is a wonderful thing, single cell life form has just evolved, and you'd go, hey, this, you're cheering as nature is moving forward. And Chris brought out, I think it was Balance of the Planet, and it's like, well, every year 40,000 people are dying from skin cancer, and it was just very, very heavy stuff. But then he took great pride in then showing you the man behind the curtain. And here's the calculation that determines how many people are dying from skin cancer. And it's like, no, a game is The Wizard of Oz. To me, that's the fantasy world. The guide moving the levers behind the curtain, that's going to be there. But that's what you don't necessarily want to be showing everybody, is the man behind the curtains. Everybody was afraid of and awed by the wonderful Oz. So I decided to leave, and it turns out that people had sort of started to take notice of my 3D work and that I'd been doing in my time at night. And there was I'm going to use the term stealth group. There was a small development group inside Atari Coin-Op. And this manager was reported up to Lyle Raines, who had created, I think, Asteroids, or I'm afraid you'll have to look this up. He was involved in a number of the very early games. Oh, he was involved in Atari Football, I think. One of the greatest and one of the first sit-down sports games in the industry. And to me, this was another amazing opportunity. I didn't find what I was hoping I'd find at corporate research, but this was, to me, like being a roadie for your favorite rock band. These were the guys who built the games that I'd been so fond of since I was a small kid. And it was amazing. I was, playing volleyball with these guys over lunch. The team that was developing the Star Wars vector-based coin-op game were in the offices across the hallway. Was working with Mark Cerny, who developed Marble Madness. Would go down to the lab. They had a great lab down there where they had motion chairs and prototype games that had never been seen, and they'd let you get inside these things and spin them around. You just had to be careful you didn't knock anybody over. So this, to me, was sort of the real heart of the Atari organization, was the Coin-Op group. And I was incredibly fortunate that what they tasked me to do was to take basically the 3D demos that I'd been working on and tried to turn them into the proper sequel of the game that I was probably had the greatest influence on me as a developer, and that was to do a sequel to Star Raiders.
Nice. So you started doing a Coin-Op sequel to Star Raiders?
No, it was
code
that
you showed me was 8-bit code. So
no, it was the team was a little bit, it was a stealth group inside Coin-Op, but the charter was go do things that other groups might not be doing. Mm-hmm. And at the time, home computer division, there was HCD, there was it CED? Consumer Electronics Division. So HCD was the Atari 800 group. CED, I think, was the VCS right. And the 5200. Mm-hmm. And even those groups didn't talk to each other. I have a number of friends that were developing games, for example, Jack Palovich and Landon Dyer. I think one was doing Dig Dug. And literally the company started up two separate teams, one that was doing Dig Dug for the Atari 800 and one that was doing them for the 5200. The only difference between those two pieces of hardware was that there were some not video ports, but the mapping of some of the capabilities were at different addresses. So if you just compiled it with a different map file, it would run on it. The other used the same sound chip, the same graphics chip. It had a different controller, but otherwise they were essentially the same machine, and yet those two divisions would rarely talk to each other. So when one of the Dig Dugs got into trouble, the consumer electronics version, my friend who I think was working on the 800 version, basically just changed some control files and ended up finally building two of them. So there was a lot of competitiveness and not as much communication. It was an organization that when I joined had over 8,000 employees. And when I left Coin-Op, I think it was fewer than 500. It was, I described it as working in a minefield where you'd come in one day and somebody would be gone and somebody would be walking down the hallways going, where's Charlie? Charlie's gone. And it was like, and I just, I was so in my area of bliss developing the game that I was working on that I just was able to stay focused on that rather than worrying about the rest of the company and what was going on there. So it was a research team inside the Coin-Op division that was essentially tasked with doing, interesting research projects. So we had, for example, one team that was literally doing a music video on the Atari 800. So it was video and art being displayed on the Atari 800 that was in sync with music that was playing off of a CD. And because at the time you didn't have any that type of audio quality on the Atari 800, but the idea was almost like, what if you were doing an MTV video? Right. Though in this case, what they chose for their music was the Manhattan Transfer's Twilight Zone. And so it's got this great beat. And then what they were doing was, what happens when you integrate art with this? Could you take a computer that's running real time and do this synchronization? And here's another project. So I mentioned how I took my girlfriend to Europe. Well, what occurred was they made me the offer to go work for the Coin-Op group. And so I spent about 2 or 3 weeks before I left for Europe furiously designing the game. And I put together about a 40 or 50-page design document. And everything looked great. And just as I was about to leave, my new boss said, and I'm bringing another engineer. He's going to start working on this while you're gone. And it's like, okay, I don't know who this person is. And I spent 6 weeks instead of enjoying myself in Europe, I spent 6 weeks going, what am I going to find when I get back? And unfortunately, that's what I found was somebody who didn't even bother to read my document, who just started writing, the long-range scan. And it had nothing to do with, or the galactic chart, had nothing to do with the way the game was designed to work. So for about a week and a half, we tried to figure out how this is going to work out together. And it just... that code wasn't going to work with the libraries that I developed, and it was actually fortunate because at that point in time, this was a very, very good engineer. We had an opportunity to work on a 3D polygonal rendered game, And it was like, you know what, maybe this is best. So he went off to do polygonal work, and I was able to then just go on and focus from the development work that I'd already done. It just took about a week or 10 days to sort of get that resolved once I got back to the team. So then I just kind of hunkered down and just started writing the code. And what you do with any piece of code is you build a solid foundation. And having written so many of these demos, I had a large foundation of core routines, drawing, everything from drawing a pixel to drawing a vector line to rotating a ship to rotating a planet. So I just kept adding to this core chunk of code. And I'd been given a couple of restraints. One of them was it had to run on a machine. Actually, I have to think about this with the specific specs. I knew I was developing two things. One was develop it as a loadable floppy disk, but I was also developing it as a cartridge. So Atari had developed a ROM cartridge, which was 32K. It was 8K that was always in memory, and then you could choose one of three different 8K blocks that you could swap in. So it was 32K total, but only 16K at any point in time. So I came up with a method where I could move my core routines, that were shared into the one 8K, and then I could move the galactic chart in one block, and I could move in the damage control screen in another, and then I could move the long-range scan or the different parts. I could move those parts in when I needed them. And met with a magazine writer at one point, and I still had a copy of that cartridge, and he was very interested in it. I loaned it to him, and I never saw it again. So somewhere out there was the one existing cartridge of Star Raiders 2 that ever existed. And then fortunately, I still had the floppy versions of it.
So how far did the project get, and why was it not released? Could it have been released? Because it was not even made in HCD. So,
to me, I'm not a politics person, and so I didn't, like I said, with all the things going on inside Atari, I just focused on what I was doing. How it was going to be released was, not at my pay grade. Is kind of, my attitude is like I was going to presume that somebody was going to figure out how that was going to work, and the best thing I could do is try to build the best game possible. So what occurred, and one of the things that I didn't mention is that engineer who had started on the long-range scan, that vector drawing routine, the solid polygonal project that he was asked to work on was a Coin-Op version of the Last Starfighter. So the idea was, let's build the game that the character in the movie is playing. So marketing had sort of gone in hook, line, and sinker that Last Starfighter was going to be the next Star Wars. And so they bought the rights. They bought the rights to the Coin-Op game, the computer game, etc. So at about the same time I was starting my project, they were starting a Coin-Op version of the game, and they'd also hired a team to build an Atari 800 version. And so they were a team of, I don't know what it was 4 or 5. I remember visiting them at one point and seeing their work, and there were some very good things that they were doing as a Last Starfighter game. And then my focus was on with Star Raiders 2. So it's like we were both in the same arena, but very different games were being developed. And so I didn't pay too close attention to that. But after I was there must have been about a year, I heard about this Star Raiders 2. And it was very much a surprise to me, because by the time I'd heard about it, it was already in the fait accompli. The movie had come out; it hadn't done too well. The marketing teams were, I think, feeling bad that they'd spent so much money, buying the rights to this movie, hiring these teams to do the development. I understand I think you may have spoken to some of the team members. I haven't had the benefit of hearing their perspective of it.
I interviewed Bruce Pullman, who was the main programmer for the Last Starfighter, Star Raiders 2?
Okay, presumably what occurred at some point, marketing came in and said, we need you to rebrand this. And so it looks like this, as quickly as possible, they took out any of the features that were very specific to Last Starfighter, and then just changed the opening screen and put the word Star Raiders 2 there.
That's pretty much what happened, except it wasn't as fast as you think it happened, and I think the only feature that actually changed was the title page.
That may be the case. It certainly looked like the same gameplay that I'd seen that had been coming together before, and it seemed very straightforward, but it certainly wasn't what I'd been working on for Star Raiders 2, which the Star Raiders brand to me was sort of at the time the pinnacle of first-person 3D real-time space combat. It's like if the military had done it, they would have done something better. But this is the best thing you could get as a consumer, and that was what I'd set out to build as well.
Right. So it seemed like the Star Raiders 2 that was released was mostly let's use this asset that we have and rebrand with the trademark that we own, where they weren't trying to be necessarily true to the Star Raiders world. But in the video I saw of your version of Star Raiders 2, it's like an enhanced version of Star Raiders. It seems like. Right?
That's what what Doug had originally written was astonishing at the time, and the goal was, okay, where can we take it from there? And there were a number of lessons that I learned. It's easy for me to sort of look back because while trying to develop it, you end up sort of having to sort of understand the engineering that went on in the original version. And there were some really just absolutely brilliant aspects of that game. And it came out of, I don't want to go too much into the math, but it came out of the way the 3D universe was created, where essentially it's this world where there's only in front of you, where you're sort of in this cube, and wherever you look becomes in front of you, and things are only moving towards you. And what's interesting is because you're targeting the Xylons, you're putting them in your crosshairs, you're actually their AI. Because what they do is they just sit there, they're just flying around, they're not doing very much. But as soon as they're in your crosshairs, all they do is drop a torpedo, and it's going right at you. So all they had to do is this very simple AI to move around, and because you're tracking them, the closer you track them, the more accurate they become, because all they're doing is dropping torpedoes. And actually the solution to you're being fired on is you actually just look away. You turn and look somewhere else, and that torpedo will turn and miss you, because it's always going down these very specific vector lines.
Well, when you think about it that way, the Xylons aren't the evil creatures in this game. It's you.
Well, what it really meant was the best AI is a human being, and what Doug did was he let the human being, he let the player fight themselves. They just didn't know that that's what they were doing. So, sort of, learn lessons from that, put focuses on, on doing 3D ships instead of the sprites, enhancing it with 3D star bases. I only uploaded video from the very first level. There are other features that are in there. There's a ground campaign, so you're flying over the terrain. And so the Xylons, couple things. So the galactic chart, instead of being the matrix, which really came from the original Star Trek computer game, becomes an open grid. So Cylons are actually traveling in, and this never got completely finished, but the beginning of the game is actually watching the beginning of the second Xylon Wars. So the first Xylon Wars, in Star Raiders, is you beat them. And this is actually, it's funny because this was written long before the sort of the recreation of Battlestar Galactica. But the Xylons get beaten, and now what you're facing is the next generation of them, the nastier version of them, as they show up. and start destroying your star bases off the perimeter. And so instead of just going grid by grid, they're slowly moving through space and moving towards Sol, or your home planet, in the upper left-hand corner. And so they go around surrounding star bases, the same concept. You can move in, try to save the star bases to try to give yourself locations to gain resources, but they're also taking over planetary systems. So they'll settle down in a planetary system and actually take over the planetary system, start creating factories, and if I've got it correct, because it's been a long time since I played the whole game, those planetary systems will actually start generating more Xylons as well. So you've got this strategic game of the galactic chart that's changed dramatically. First-person game, the key changes was I went with lasers rather than firing photon torpedoes. And the downside of that is kind of funny because it took a little bit, because now you can shoot something that's not in your crosshairs, it took away that whole aspect that when a Xylon's in your crosshairs, they're the most dangerous. So you can actually, in the version that I've got, you can try to keep the Xylons just off the center of your crosshairs and hit them with your lasers, and they're less dangerous that way. So it's more strategic, but it meant what I needed to do is the opportunity to finish off the AI for the enemy ships, which would have actually involved sort of doing these crossing patterns down through your crosshair. So if you tried to use that tactic, it would work to a certain extent, but then they would get a little bit smarter and then start flying down through your through the center of the screen in order to drop the torpedoes on you. So that's the aspect of the game that I felt wasn't really there. It was probably a month or two from what I thought would be completed. But I think between a couple of blows, one was, as I'd mentioned, Atari went from 8,000 to 500 employees. Last Starfighter got rebranded, and so that sort of took a little bit of the air out of the Star Raiders 2 balloon. And then, like I said, it was like working in a minefield, and I came in one day and found that my office was the latest crater, and it was still okay. It's like I'd been working on this thing. I'd put my heart and soul into it for a year, but I'm always thinking about, okay, what'll I do next? And at the time, the either CED or HCD, the home computer division, had been sold to the Tramiel brothers, so Sam Tramiel. They, I believe, thought they were going to get the Amiga computer, but the Amiga computer, which had been developed actually, I think, inside Atari, got that team then took the money and gave the money back to Atari and then sold it to Commodore. I don't know all the stories going on there, but I approached the Tramiel brothers and said, look, I've got this game. It's a few months from completion. Are you interested? And they were, enthusiastic and sure, we'll support you. And I went out and I bought a new hard drive and probably spent a month or so on my time. Went in for my second meeting, and I couldn't get them to commit to anything. It's like, can you put something in paper? No, just finish it up and we'll go from there. And I realized, it's not a good deal because I'm working on a game they own the rights to. And I could finish it and give them a copy. Oh, we need to test it. And they'd just say, you know what? This is, we did this, just keep working on it. They could sell it as they wanted to. So eventually I put it in a box. But the truth of the matter is, when I was at Atari, there was this, at the same time I was at Atari, there was a research group that had been started by George Lucas, and that was Lucasfilm Games. And I got to know that original crew. So Peter Langston, who I think had written one of the original, it wasn't Zork, but it was one of the maze, the dungeon games that was on the mainframes. I think he developed it when he was at Bell Labs. And then David Fox was working on, I think it was called Behind Jaggy Lines at the time, but it got released as Rescue on Fractalus. And Dave Levine was working on what was called Ball Blaster, but eventually became Ball Blazer. Those were all being developed to be released by Atari. And what I found was they'd bring a copy in that would be to be shown to somebody in marketing. And within about 5 days, there were copies all over the company that people were sharing. And within a couple days after that, they were showing up on, outside the company. So I had a little conversation with Peter and just said, you guys, when you show up here, take the floppies back with you. Don't stop leaving them here because it's going to start to become a problem. As it turned out, those games both had to be rebranded because so many versions had been sold or given away or handed out under the old names that when they finally got to the point of releasing them, I think through Activision, they had to be rebranded. Anyway, they invited me up during the summer just to show some of the work that I'd been doing. So I showed the early demos I did of planets and spaceships and such. And they said, gee, that's great. Thanks for coming on up here. And I felt, honored that they invited me up to their facilities. And about a week later, I got a message saying that they were interested in hiring me. And so my reply was, when do you want to set up the interview? And they told me, oh, no, we interviewed you last week. So it's the easiest interview I've ever had in my life.
Nice. So now you're at Lucasfilm Games. What did you get to do there?
Oh, boy, 15 years at Lucasfilm Games that became LucasArts. And the original work was shared a room with, or an office with Ron Gilbert, who's probably best known for the Monkey Island series and I'm going to say Day of the Tentacle and Maniac Mansion and such. An amazing team there, and it was an interesting transition. So the reason Lucasfilm had worked closely with Atari was Atari had more money than they knew what to do with. So my understanding was that Atari put up a few $1 million so that they could rub elbows with George Lucas. And so they put money to create this development group, and then Atari was going to have first right of refusal to ship the games. And so when I arrived, it was just at that transition point where the money had all been spent, and some of it on, things like let's buy a Lisp machine to simulate games, or I know there was some hardware that had been bought and used by other parts inside the company. And it was just the point where that organization was going from an R&D group into a group that had to be self-sustaining and do product development. And that's something I fit right in with, because all my years, certainly the years at Automated, everything was product oriented. And if I didn't get the product done on time, I wasn't going to be making any money off of it. So I was very comfortable in the environment of a development organization. There were a few people that really came out of the R&D side and felt that you couldn't build a product out of, when you were under pressure. And I remember one meeting, I'm going to tell you a tale. So, in a meeting, and one of these developers came into the meeting and with our president at the time and basically said, I can't be creative under pressure. Creativity doesn't work under pressure. And our president, who was Steve Arnold, had been a practicing he was a practicing psychologist, and he'd actually come over from Atari. And he said, I need to tell you this story. He said, when I was working as a psychologist, I had a number of patients, and one of my patients told me he was having a crisis and asked me to come over to his house. And he said, foolishly, I went over to the house, and as I walked in the door, he locked the door behind me, and he pulled out a gun. And the patient said to Steve, if you can't help me feel better, neither of us is going to be leaving this room. And Steve said, you've got to believe I've never been under more pressure in my life, and I've never been more creative in my life. So when you're sitting here trying to tell me that you can't be creative under pressure, I call that fallacious and try to come up with another line why you can't develop a product. So great, like I said, a little bit of a tough transition for some people going into product development. Sharing an office with Ron was amazing as a designer, and just I probably never laughed harder or had my, I remember one time Ron and I had a disagreement in how to approach a problem, and it just it turned into a yelling match, and Ron finally got up and walked out the door and slammed it behind him. And it was like, okay, we're done with that. And he came in 5 minutes later with a smile on his face and said, okay, we got that out of the way. How are we going to solve this? And we ended up working for about another hour. And what we found was his solution and my solution each had benefits. And we ended up finding a third solution that we both agreed on that had all the strengths. So we were each arguing for why ours was the best solution because we saw the benefits. We ended up with a hybrid solution that was the best of both of our works. And so that was an incredibly important lesson for me about product development and working with teams and how to approach these, a standoff, like, when you have something like that. So, in the Lucas companies, I was one of the, first it was a number of Atari 800 games, including, and even I think it was the 65 XE, there was an Atari, another game machine that came out, so I did the
XEGS,
it might have been that. I just remember I did a version of Ball Blazer for that. But to be honest, engineering-wise, it was pretty straightforward. It just needed to be done. And one of the neat projects there was Chip Morningstar came up with this concept called Habitat, which was one of the first, and I don't know all the, massively multiplayer RPGs. Mm-hmm. And basically the service holds the universe and you'd log in. This is on a Commodore 64. And you'd log in and you could walk your character around inside this universe, go from place to place, see other characters, pick up items. And because of my, I'm not an artist, but I knew all the graphics code. I was essentially brought in to do the world generation tools, the characters themselves. And, how do you pick something up? How do you hold it when you're carrying it? And then one of the epiphanies I had was, well, you could even take your head off. And pretty soon after that, we had vending machines where you could actually drop in coins and you could get a different head. So you could pick up different personalities. Worked with...
Was there, this is apropos of nothing. This is answering another question from like 6 months ago. Was there a bug where you could steal someone's head?
I don't know. If they put it on the ground, yes, you could. Because something on the ground becomes public. The problem is to take it off and put it in your pocket required you to put it on the ground, which meant, yes, it could. I think the answer is yes, you could have your head stolen if you didn't put it in your pocket fast enough.
Okay, great. You just answered a question about a completely different product from an interview from like 8 months ago, so thanks.
Oh, okay. And it was interesting because we were working with a company called Quantum Link out of Virginia. So West Coast, East Coast, sort of different mentalities and approaches. One of the interesting things is the SCUM system, which was used for Maniac and Monkey Island and a number of the Indiana Jones games and Loom and Full Throttle and Sam & Max, et cetera, was based around, it was an interpreted language. So that meant that you wrote in this language that we created called SCUM, and that language would then get turned into these 1-byte tokens that the game engine would then look at. So you'd give it a command like walk Dr. Fred to door. And that would be turned into a 1-byte command that said, oh, this is a walk command. And then the next byte or a couple bytes would be who it is. It's Dr. Fred, and Dr. Fred is the third character in the game, so it would pass a 3. And then the next parameter was what do you walk to, and it would be object door. And so those 3 bytes would actually trigger a very complex process because wherever Dr. Fred was, that script would trigger, and then following that, you'd do a command like wait for Dr. Fred. So that script would go to sleep while Dr. Fred would do a turn animation, would start walking, would walk around chairs, and then eventually he would arrive at the door. And so the scripting language at the SCUM level was 2 lines, and yet what occurred in the gameplay was incredibly sophisticated. It involved scaling, drawing, clipping, walk paths. All these things had to occur. But scripting it was very straightforward. Well, that was an interpreted language, and the original Scum language was very much Ron and Chip's creation and tokenizing. On Habitat, which was Chip's creation, he didn't use a tokenized language. He used 6502 assembly for every object. So if you picked up a magic wand, that magic wand now is a little piece of 6502 assembly language code that was now moving around in memory. And the downside of that is that meant any bug in that code is going to blow up your system. Suddenly you've got a rogue piece of 6502 assembly language, and it's moved around in memory, and something's changed, and this register's done this. And we spent months and months and months tracking down these little mistakes. In the Scum engine, you had these 3 bytes, and you'd grab the first byte, and it said, oh, it's a command. And you could look at it, and if it's not one of your honest, proper commands, then you could throw it on the ground. And if it's not one of the proper actors, you could throw it on the ground. And if it's not a proper object you're going to walk to, so you had 3 ways to check to make sure that what you're going to do was valid. And if not, you could flag an error and we could go debug it. But on the Habitat universe, any piece of code that just started executing something, you never knew what blew up and where it was in memory. So, sort of same engineers, but took 2 different philosophies towards 2 projects. One which worked beautifully, and the other one that just made us crazy for months.
Do you have any insight on why there wasn't a version of Habitat for the Atari?
When Habitat was first developed, first thing is Quantum Link was Commodore 64 centric.
Right, yeah, that's true.
And so they were interested in that market. I don't recall having a modem for my 800. So there was a like 150 baud modem, and it might have been a 300 and a 1200 baud modem. So there were 2 modems eventually for the Commodore 64. And we were built on services that were designed to talk to the Commodore 64.
Sure, I forgot about the Quantum Link connection. That makes sense, because that was a Commodore service. Wow, so what else did you work? You worked on, you said Ball Blazer, or you reported Ball Blazer and...
Ball Blazer, Maniac Mansion. I became the lead. So I was... this was back before the IBM PC was really, it wasn't a game machine, and it's many people, today it passes for one. But I was always interested in new hardware, so I learned the PC, and so I brought Maniac Mansion over from the Commodore 64 and to the PC, and then from that, I managed cross-platform, so I managed the games and the game engine that I managed to all the different machines that it ran on. Ron eventually left to start up a company called Humongous Entertainment, and that was an interesting development because they were using the Scum system. So Ron had made an agreement, and Ron and I would get together for pizza and beers every few months and go, these people don't really understand what we've built. Here, if we started up a company, we could make a fortune at this, and it always just ended up with, gee, that was a good dinner of pizza and beer and bitching, and then at one point a new producer came in, and Ron and she sort of hit it off, and she had a property up in the Seattle area, and Ron and she decided, okay, hey, we're going to make this thing happen, and they asked me if I wanted to go. I had a home in Marin. I just wasn't ready to pull the ripcord at the time. So he started Humongous, and even invited me up at one point to see if I'd come on board. And I think I was there in June, and somebody was saying how lucky I was because it was the first sunny afternoon they'd had all month. And I was going, wait, today's the 22nd. It's June. This is the first nice day of weather you've had. I think I'll stay in the Bay Area. I think that was what made up my mind there. But anyway, but he used the Scum engine, and we actually ended up supporting each other. So even though he was a separate company, we for quite some time we shared code both directions, and they did Sam and Max Hits the Road, Putt Putt. I'm sorry, not Sam and Max. They did Pajama Sam and Putt Putt Saves the Zoo,
Spy
and
Fox,
Spy Fox, and
sure.
and yeah, in Dry Cereal, and on a lot of these products where. A lot of Ron's humor really came out in those, And then they did the Backyard Baseball series, et cetera. And those were all done using the SCUM system. In the meantime, on our side, we did Day of the Tentacle, Monkey Island 3. We did Full Throttle. We did oh goodness, I think it was Curse of Monkey. So it's interesting because a lot of people, it was like Ron. To them, Ron was the game engine, and he'd built parts of it, and I'd built parts of it, and there was sort of this, well, if Ron goes away, the system's, it's over. And I try to explain that, when the architect leaves the building, it doesn't fall down. And I don't know if that message quite got through, but we still continued to use the system for probably another 4 years or so. A couple times they tried to build replacements for it. So when the Dig was being developed, so Steven Spielberg had an idea for a product he called the Dig, which was sort of a cross between Forbidden Planet and Treasure of the Sierra Madre. So here you arrive at this planet, it's got this amazing technology, and then the people that get there start backstabbing each other because they're the one, they want to get their hands on the technology just for themselves. And so Spielberg had this concept, he was going to use it for amazing stories, but just didn't know how he could do it in a half-hour format. And so he approached us to do a game with it. And the first person to tackle it, I think, was Brian Moriarty, who had worked for Infocom on products like Trinity. Boy, I'm afraid you're going to have to look up his other...
Yeah, Brian Moriarty did a ton of great stuff for Infocom, sure.
Exactly. And then he had done Loom, which was a very, very different concept using the SCUM engine, where basically inventory is spells, or actually musical spells, even at that. And so he took a swing at it, but he wanted to build a new game engine. So they spent about a year developing the game engine, got the opening scene pretty much done, and then invited us to an introductory, we call them pizza orgies, where we'd get together with pizza and we'd play people's games and then provide feedback. So it was a way that the whole team could, you'd get the game up to a point where it was presentable, and then you bring it up for the first, it's like the first screening. Well, Brian wasn't there for that. And so, and shortly after that, he left, I think, for another company. I think it was Rocket Science. And I was a little frustrated with Rocket Science because here we'd been building games for so many years, and Wired Magazine decided to put them on the cover and describe them as, I think, game development's next rock supergroup. And it wasn't too long after that the founders started talking about this thing he called the waffle theory, which is he was trying to explain why the first games were so bad. But, when you make waffles, the first ones get kind of burned. So don't worry about the fact that the first games are bad, because the next round of games are going to be really good. Well, it's what it was. So Brian took a swing at the Dig, and then next, I think Noah Falstein took a swing at it, and that didn't work too well. And then finally, I think it was, I'd have to look at it, I think it was Sean Clark, I think, and Mike Stemley. And so their approach was, first, we're not going to use this other wacky game engine. We're going to go back to use SCUM, which we know how it works. And also, when Noah, I think, started the Dig, his first project was throwing away all of Brian's art. I think Sean and Mike just said, we're going to start with the art that's been done and try to use that as much as possible. Let's just get this game done, because it was, by that time, it had been probably 3 years in development.
Wow.
Then, so other games we did the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade based on the movie. We did Hal Barwood, who went to movie school with George, came in and did Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, which I thought was a great, probably one of his best, one of the best games that he did. Though I have to say, at times he was frustrated with the SCUM system, because you play in a sandbox, and when it's not your sandbox, you see the walls, and he always felt that the SCUM system had walls that he couldn't get over. And part of it was, well, we gave you these tools and made them easy, but when you do that, you do have to put limits on them. So And Hal's always funny. Every once in a while, I'll see Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And you know how when you're switching channels, you end up in the middle of a movie or at the end of the movie. Well, Hal is one of the people that comes off the alien spaceship at the end of Close Encounters. So he's like a 1940s World War II pilot. And so when the spaceship finally opens up and all these people start walking out of it, Hal is being interviewed by the, whatever it is, the CIA, because he and his plane, I guess, had disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle. So it's nice to see Hal back when he did the one of the rewrites of the story for Close Encounters.
Nice. Very cool. All right, so getting back, I want to touch a little bit more on Star Raiders 2.
Absolutely.
So when you left, why did you bring it with you? Because the fact that it survived is amazing. And when are you going to release it? You mentioned something about you want to finish it before you release it. Tell me the story about when we're going to see this unreleased game.
Boy, I don't know what to do. So I'd mentioned that when I left Atari, I bought this big hard drive. Trust me, this is a 6 megabyte hard drive. Now keep in mind
that's
that
huge. You're never going to fill that.
At the time, right, 6 megabytes was huge. It's now not even, now you can get a SIM chip with God knows how many gigabytes on it, where you wouldn't even know that it's in there. It's probably like the data check file would be the size of this entire hard drive. So the development was on that hard drive. We tried to, I visited some friends. We tried to bring the hard drive back up, but it was not happy. But I did have the floppies, and so worked with some friends, and they were able to pull the floppy images off. I mentioned that the cartridge is gone, and so I've got a disk image. Now, that was about 2 years ago. I wrote up some controls, wrote up a little bit of the history that I sent you, and you're welcome to post a little bit of that history about the game.
Thank you.
I haven't really come up with a strategy. Originally, I was thinking it would be a lot of fun to go to the Game Developers Conference and speak about basically what I learned about Star Raiders, the original Star Raiders. And I was thinking about talking about how on a 6502 that was running, I think it was 1 megahertz processor, which means, your typical laptop today is got many, many tens of thousands of multiple processors and graphics processors and everything else, many thousands of times the capability of what this poor little Atari 800 had at the time. But basically talk about how my understanding of how the original Star Raiders was created and approach it from, the 3D model that was used. And then I was going to sort of end the speech with, and here's the sequel that never got released. And it's kind of tough because one of the reasons you and I are in touch is that I saw a posting on a friend's board about the fact that there's a group that's trying to recreate the source code for the original Star Raiders.
They're done. Yes. And
I have to say that for, I guess it's now, 31 years, I've had a copy of the source code in a box in the garage, though I brought it out and showed it to a few people a couple of years ago, and I haven't found it since then. But when I started to do Star Raiders, somebody said, "Oh, here," and dropped it off on my desk and said, "This might help." And trust me, I went through the code, and there were bits and pieces I could take from it, but it was like trying to take apart a very intricate jewel and thinking that you were going to figure out how the jewel had been created. And it was actually easier to then just start with a fresh slate and really study the game itself from the outside to see how the game played in order to create a new one. So I saw this effort on GitHub to try to create the original Star Raiders, and I thought it would be kind of funny to put a video of Star Raiders 2, which had never been released, in one of their bug reports and basically say, "Hey, I got the game compiled and look what came out." And I guess they didn't understand why it was funny because they thought, well, what I was posting was the last Starfighter version of Star Raiders, and they thought that wasn't a very funny joke. And but I also sent a copy off to you, and I think your reply was, "What is this thing I'm looking at?" Because it wasn't really, I didn't really explain it. I guess it's been in my, in a box in my garage for so many years that I just didn't think it needed too much explaining.
No, it was a great joke, but you're the only one with the context to get the joke. So,
that's probably very, very much true. I can't say my sense of humor is always understood. But you asked, I haven't answered your question. What am I going to do with it? I right now have no idea. So I could release it where it'll run on one of the simulators, but I'd hate to, after 31 years, release a game that gets bad reviews. So I sort of feel like, let's say you went to a movie maker who was partway through making their movie. The studio went out of business. They've got all the footage that they shot, and they put something together, and now you're going to put the movie out, and people are going to review it. And it's just like, boy, it would really pain me to release it and have people say, this gameplay feels like it's not really polished, because I know the gameplay isn't really polished.
Right. I get that, but I want to put it out there that movie makers do exactly that. They have a rough cut. They show it to test audiences, and then they see, the ending sucks, or, the music doesn't resonate, or whatever it is. And I think that if you put it out there now, you could say, this isn't done, this is a rough cut, this is code from 30 years ago, I intend on finishing it. But my worry, to be honest, is that you don't get to it, that you're busy with life. My worry is that my worry is that you get hit by a truck next week, and then it's really gone. And if you put it out there now, unfinished, it will be out there, and that bit of history will be preserved. Right. And if you want to go ahead and make it perfect, and you want to take 10 years to do it, great. But in the meantime, we're not in limbo,
Yeah, I'd hate to be having the other critics, which is, they changed who shot first. Was it Han or Greedo?
Right.
It's like you can't spend the rest of your life polishing something. And it's funny because I just brought up my desktop. And it's like the file is sitting, the disk image is sitting right there. And with one click, it could be in an email. I just had thought, I should do something better than that. But, we're approaching the holiday season. So why don't you and I talk a little bit offline and see whether or not there might be something in everybody's stocking this year. What am I committing myself to? I don't know, but why don't you and I talk offline, and
great.
And I'll let you twist my arm for a little bit.
Okay, great. Good. All right, so I know you're on your lunch break and we can't do this forever. So tell me, first of all, what haven't I asked you about the Atari days that I should have?
It was as wonderful as you could hope for. I worked with some amazing people. I had amazing highs and amazing, were they amazing lows? Some of them were, some of the disappointments from the Atari research. And in some ways, even right now, I regret some of the things that I said, because even though philosophically I disagreed with my boss at the time, the doors were open that could not have been opened for me any other way. Star Raiders I can't look at as a failure because it was never released, but then I look at what I did at LucasArts and what I've done since then. I've had this great fortune where I was involved in the early days of the home computer industry. I went from there. We hadn't touched on this. I worked on the T-Mobile Sidekick phones, which predated the iPhone, but it was one of the first consumer smartphones where you had a browser and you could text messaging and email. You could get your email in your pocket. You could it's like all those things. We had an app store where you could download games and other apps on the product. And I'm currently working for a startup about to do some amazing things in yet another industry. So if I look at that one point where in time, the doors and the path that it's gotten me to has just been amazing. Mostly what I've got are just great memories.
Awesome. That was fantastic. Thank you, Aric.
All right, Kevin.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.